Do you find yourself struggling to climb the DPS meters? Or maybe you're happy with your performance, but you want to take it to the next level. In this video, I'm gonna give you 4 simple ways how you can improve your performance during raids as a warrior, and we're starting right now. So the first thing you can start doing right away in your next raid is to time your cooldown usage. You see, as a warrior, the last 20% of the boss is where we do the most significant chunk of our damage, because that's the moment where we can start pressing execute. And simply put, since that's where you do the most amount of damage, you want to stack your cooldowns during that window so that you can do even more damage. It sounds simple at first, but it's actually more complex than it sounds. Because you can't just wait until the boss is at 20% and blow your cooldowns. That only works if the boss dies so slowly that you know your cooldowns are gonna fit inside the last 20% window entirely. But in Classic, 9 times out of 10, bosses die very quickly. So quickly in fact that if you simply popped your cooldowns when the boss reaches 20%, you would find yourself having Death Wish, for example, still being up for several seconds after the boss is dead. Seconds that could have been used for the boss had you pressed the button sooner. Instead, what you want to do, and I'm gonna use Death Wish as an example again with its 30 seconds duration, what you want to do is to overlap Death Wish with the last 30 seconds of the boss, so that it fits in the execute window, but also so that Death Wish doesn't last over the boss's death. And by the way, your cooldowns can include Death Wish and Recklessness, but also Diamond Flask, Earth Strike, Mighty Rage Potions, etc. The idea is always the same. Any item that gives a buff that lasts for a limited amount of time, you want to use that item so the buff ends as close to the boss's death as possible. So there's multiple ways how high-ranked warriors go about doing this. Some just eyeball it, and if you find yourself often joining pugs, that's really the only option for you. Or if it's Dark Moonfair week, where the damages will be unpredictable. Some other people look at their DBM record timer, and they time their cooldown usage according to this. This is good if you know your guild consistently breaks records every week. Now, what most warriors do, and what I personally do myself, is they look at their guild logs. You look at your last few guild raids and you see on average how long every boss takes to die, and you can easily know in advance how long into the fight you should use your cooldowns that way. Now this could be a video by its own, because if you want to take this to the next level, you could create a spreadsheet and make weak auras for this. But this video would be too long if I went down this rabbit hole. Instead, if you want me to make a video explaining exactly how to do this, let me know in the comment section. The next thing you can do to improve your DPS is to remember one rule of thumb. If you're fully word buffed, you should always be spamming Heroic Strike, no matter what. That's a mistake I made myself for the longest time, until someone pointed it out to me. There's a lot of guides online that tell you that your priority when it comes to abilities is Bloodlust over Whirlwind over Heroic Strike. While I'm sure that's the case if you're a new ungeared warrior, which is who those guides are for honestly, in Classic, having World Buff switches your Heroic Strike priority over Whirlwind. Now, if you have very low rage and your Bloodlust is coming off cooldown, of course you should stop for a second and cast your Bloodlust first. But more often than not, this never happens if you're fully word buffed. And you can just spam Heroic Strike, and doing that will improve your DPS drastically. And the reason for that is because spamming Heroic Strike does 2 things. 1, it replaces your auto attacks, and obviously does more damage. But also, 2, since it replaces your auto attacks, it acts as an ability. And if you're hit capped, which is 6% for humans and orcs and other races with Edgemasters and Handguards, if you're hit capped, your attacks simply will never miss. The third thing you can do to improve your DPS is to use the right consumables at the right time. Now obviously, using offensive consumables is going to increase your DPS. I'm going to show a list of consumables that have a direct impact on your output, and if you're missing anything from this list, I urge you to go grab it. But I assume you have all of these. Those are not the consumables I'm talking about here. What I'm referring to instead is consumes that have an indirect impact on your DPS, namely FAPs, Lips, and all of the resistance potions. These 3 share cooldowns, and depending on the encounter, you want to choose which ones you're gonna use. For example, Razorgore often does a stomp that stuns all the melees around him, and obviously, if you're stunned, you're not gonna do any DPS. So you want to use Fabs before Razor Gore becomes active, to mitigate that and continue DPSing after he uses his Stomp. Another example is Battle God Sartura. She often spins around, hitting every melee in proximity. If you don't want to die, you're going to have to move away from her. But you can mitigate that by using a Lip and continue DPSing her through her Whirlwind. And finally, there's bosses that do a lot of damage from a certain school of magic, like Fire Maw, Shazra, or Huhuran. What you can do on those is what is called pre-potting your resistance potions. The buff they give lasts 1 hour, but their cooldown is 2 minutes. So you want to use one of those 1 to 2 minutes before the fight starts, so that you can use another one during the fight, and thus allowing you to stay in proximity to the boss longer, and thus increasing your DPS. And then for every boss that doesn't have a special mechanic like that, you want to use Mighty Rage Potions and overlap them with the last 20 seconds of the boss. Those also share cooldowns with the previous 3 potions I mentioned, so you won't be able to use them if you're gonna use one of the other ones. And finally, world buffs. Now, of course, world buffs increase your DPS by a huge amount, and of course you should be using them. And if you're not using them, there's the easiest way for you to increase your DPS by a ridiculous amount. But what I want to talk about here is a world buff that not many Alliance players go for, and sometimes even Horde players neglect its duration: Warchief's Blessing. I made a whole video about Warchief's Blessing and how you can get it as consistently as possible. Go check it out if you're interested. But if you want to go for the extra mile and increase your DPS by a huge margin, I strongly suggest you consider getting Warchief's Blessing. The 15% haste it gives is huge, and it scales ridiculously well with us warriors. You're basically stacking all world buffs and consumables, which by their own make you extremely strong, but then you're putting 15% haste on top of all of that. It's just disgusting how crazy your DPS becomes with this one buff. If you're a Horde player, I urge you to not neglect this buff and save its duration as much as possible, since it only lasts 1 hour. And if you're an Alliance player, I strongly suggest you consider getting it if you want to go the extra mile. As I said, I will include a link to a guide I made on how you can get this buff on the Alliance side, and you should check it out. So that's all I have for today. Let me know in the comments if I made you learn something in this video, yes or no. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. I post classic WoW content every week, and if you like this one, you will like the ones I post in the future. Whatever you do, remember to have fun, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Bye for now.